Well, wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for continuing to stick with us. I promise there will be no tears on this panel. This has been a long day filled with lots of ideas, and since you all are going to be thinking through these ideas in the coming years, I am proud to say there's been a lot of good work and good budget process reform, things that have been shared throughout the afternoon that we will make sure you all know about. I'm really thrilled to have this panel to be joined by Senator Perdue and Senator Whitehouse to talk about this at obviously a perfect moment, since this is about to be a year of focusing on budget process reform. But these are two senators who have been working very hard on this issue long before it became cool. It is now cool. And have put in a lot of work. Did you know that?
No,
yeah.
Really?
I think you made it cool. They put in a lot of work to thinking about these different kinds of reforms and ideas. And so I'm just going to throw open a couple questions to them and have them really talk about from their experience in actually trying to legislate. It's very different from those of us on the outside to come up with all sorts of white papers and great ideas and things to helpfully just turn the process around so you can get great fiscal outcomes and make hard choices. But once you spend some time in the Senate or the House, I think that they are probably well aware of big challenges that we don't have to go through. So let's just start the discussion. We are here in this moment, and there is going to be a big, hopefully productive effort to really look at budgets and appropriations and process reform and how that will go, what changes we could make. And we've talked a lot today about there are small incremental changes, there are ways to make budgeting more transparent and open, there are changes to the committees, there's huge overhauls. But let's start at the beginning, which is, given your work on the budget committees and in the Senate, what problems should we actually be trying to solve with all of this?
Well, I've been on the budget committee the whole time I've been in the Senate, 10 years now. And I have come to the conclusion that the process is completely useless and defective.
So not the small incremental changes, we're going to need more.
No, you really got to fix the underlying problems with the budget committee itself and giving it a role. And to me, that means three things. One, there's got to be some penalty for blowing through the budget. Right now, the penalty is you have to amass 60 votes for whatever measure you're going to take to blow through the budget. Well, the Senate's been operating under a 60-vote rule now for years. So demanding 60 votes in an institution that demands 60 votes is no penalty whatsoever. So there's a problem. Problem two is that the budget process only looks at certain appropriations accounts. It doesn't look at the billions and billions and billions of dollars that go out the back door of the tax code in tax expenditures, despite, I think, the unanimous recommendations of bipartisan witnesses that we have to look at that side. That hits the budget just as much as an appropriated expenditure. And then you got to look at the healthcare piece. And when you look at the $3 trillion that seems to have fallen out of federal healthcare expenditures, you know, not knowing why that happened is a really big oversight. We really need to come into to focus on that. And the third is that there has to be some value, some reward for a bipartisan process, because otherwise, what the Budget Committee has become now is a mechanism for the majority party to get around the 60-vote rule with one thing by doing a reconciliation measure, and poof, off it goes. And then it goes back into, back to sleep and doesn't wake up again until it needs another reconciliation measure. Mm-hmm. So I think if we can solve those three problems, now you've got a committee that means something. It's actually addressing the full scope of the budget problem, and there's a reward of some kind for bipartisanship as opposed to just everybody going to their foxholes.
Well, first of all, I congratulate you guys for sitting through what is now almost, 3 hours of this.
Look at this. There's even an overflow room.
Well,
it's got to be Washington.
Let me start. I really want to, I thank Maya and her group for really causing this to be spearheaded. Ever since I got in the Senate 3 years ago, Maya and I have been talking about this, and I've been asking for this select committee. We'll see if it can make a difference, but let me start at step one. I don't know what you've talked about today. If I'm redundant, I'll apologize, but I don't get a chance many times to talk to people who understand this, and so I'm gonna go for it here, and you'll forgive me, I hope. This budget process is absolutely broken. It's only worked 4 times in funding the government in 44 years since the 74 Budget Act. I met some people who actually voted for that bill in 74, and they're calling for its revision today. The shocking thing is that you have to appropriate today in the Senate, by the way. And by the way, the Senate is where most of the problem is. I'm not a fan of reconciliation, neither is Senator Whitehouse. I think we agree on a lot of the things in here. But if you look at this, we have to appropriate 12 bills to fund the government. We've only averaged 2.5. 2.5 over 44 years. And not only that, but Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has actually shut the government down 20 times in those 44 years. This is a system that does not allow for active debate. I fought hard to get on the Budget Committee coming from the business world thinking, well, this is where the action is. Well, it's a joke. I would blow the Budget Committee up unless we change some of these rules. Seriously, it does nothing. And so what it does is there are 3 steps in our process. And by the way, there are 3 Democrats and about a dozen Republicans who have been working on this off and on over the last couple of years. Senator Whitehouse has been a leader in this, and he and I are not necessarily known as politically aligned, and yet on this issue, we see this very similarly. And that is that, you have a 3-step process. One is the budget process starts with the budget committee putting a budget out. It is not a budget that anybody has support in except for the majority party. It is not a law, it's a resolution. And so the majority party can cram down the throat of the minority its version of the financial future of the country. Then you go to an authorization process. Well, guys, we got $315 billion of expenditures today. They're not authorized. The State Department, I was on Foreign Relations, the State Department until 2 years ago had not been authorized in 15 years. So it's a joke. The minority party says, well, you didn't ask our opinion in the budget process, so we won't help you in the authorization process, and nothing ever gets to 60 votes. Then they go to appropriations. All the appropriations bills pass in committee. You can't get them to the floor because, again, the minority party, and I'm not talking about Democrats now, because go back a few years, Republicans did the same thing. There's enough blame for this $20 trillion of debt up there for both parties. This is insane that it's taken 44 years to get to this point. Other attempts have been made. The Ryan Murray attempt back in 2011 actually failed and ended up with sequester. So to me, the bottom line is one thing and one thing only. There are a number of systems that can work in funding the federal government. It's the number one requirement, responsibility of the Congress. And yet the 21 Budget Act actually created the OMB that in my mind, I can look at the three paragraphs of the Constitution to describe what the presidency is supposed to do. I don't see this in there at all. As a matter of fact, what's happened is because of the total gridlock in the Senate, primarily, but in Congress in terms of funding the government, the executive branch over the last 50 years has really stepped in and drives the process now. And so the release valve is the problem, and you've got to fix it with one thing. It doesn't matter which system you use. In my mind, Maya, you have to have consequences that are real and that preclude the release valve that we have today. And that release valve is we go to an omnibus after over 180, CRs over the last 44 years. We end up in an omnibus where 6 people get in the room, decide how to spend $1 trillion. That's not acceptable any longer.
Give us, I just was thinking about this listening to the two of you, give us an insider sense of what it's actually like to be on the budget committee. Because the way I picture a budget is the way I picture it with my nonprofit, where if I didn't deliver to my board a budget ahead of time, I wouldn't have a job.
Well, we haven't done a budget. We did a budget in 15. It lasted 4 months, and it was waived, so we could do a reconciliation. And then we've used reconciliation twice, maybe 3 times since then. So who are we kidding here? The budget process is not producing a product.
But that's almost the question I'm asking. So are you kidding yourselves? Do you guys go to meetings and pretend you're making budgets that we're going to stick to? Or do you not have meetings? Sort of, what is it like to be on the budget committee?
If you went to these meetings, the last one, I gave this, you get 5 minutes. We had a witness. And I knew what the answers were going to be. So we got those in our questions independently. So I just made a comment. I got through, and about 15 minutes later, Senator Whitehouse gave his comment. And I could have given his speech, he could have given my speech. We see the same thing. It creates a lot of the partisanship, I believe, in the Senate. I'm looking at this from the outside. And we start in January. We're supposed to have a budget by April 15th. And by the way, that's already 3 months. In the first year of a new Congress, that's already 3 months into the new year. 3 months. So here we are right now. We're trying to fumble through to get an omnibus done. We're halfway through this current fiscal year.
What it's like being on the budget committee is for hearings, you sit in one of the smaller and more remote conference rooms in the Capitol complex and look out at a very small audience of chairs that maybe is half filled, mostly with interns. And because everybody knows that nothing we do matters, so why show up? There's never anything at stake. When we do the voting on the budget, it's foreordained what's going to happen. One side has written it already. They've lined up the votes. They're going to jam it through, period, end of story. They usually don't care about the budget. It's a sidebar to getting the reconciliation, which is the real goal. So people do a little bit of like point scoring, back and forth and asking for the sort of, budget neutral reserve accounts to do this, that, and the other. If we never passed another budget neutral reserve account for anything, it would be a sign that things have gotten a lot more sensible. I actually came in, I thought, oh cool, we're doing a budget neutral reserve account for this. Maybe something's gonna happen. And then over the years I came to realize that's a complete time waster.
Well, and then we have the vote-a-rama.
And vote-a-rama, then you get to the floor, and that's where it turns into a real clown show.
Which we seem to do very well.
The one thing we did that was good at the end of the last vote-a-rama clown show, the final amendment was a Perdue White House amendment that more or less said in slightly improved legislative language, this really sucks and we need to change it. And not only did it pass by voice vote, it passed by with like cheers and acclamation. So there's a very strong bipartisan feeling on the floor that this is just a completely negative, unhelpful, divisive, useless process.
Let me give you just a little hope here. I mean, there are several of us in several White Houses.
I feel hopeful after that.
We can, yeah, I know. You got to first, what do they say in AA? First you got to
admit your
problem.
Well, there are some people who don't want to fix this.
Appropriators.
Well, and by the way, I don't think that, I have to be very careful with it because I get accused of this sometimes when I talk about it, but the problem here is not with appropriators. The problem is not with appropriators. They're trying to do their job. The problem is the structure itself can never work. I mean, there's not enough calendar weeks just physically to do 16 authorizing committees and 12 appropriating committees and a 3.5-month budget process. You've got 8 or 10 weeks left to do breaks and everything else. There's not enough time in the year to do that. And you start the first year of the new Congress 3 months behind anyway. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we've done a good bit of work looking at best practices. We look at countries, companies, and states. And what we found is the United States federal government is the only one that funds its government this way with a 3-step process. It just isn't necessary and it won't work. And there are a lot of different ways that you can go at this, but what we found is it doesn't matter what you do, you've got to have consequences and due dates. And the 2 due dates that are critical is the budget's got to be completed by an early point in time in the year, just like every company does. And then you go through the time for the allocation process, which they call appropriation process in Congress. And that needs to be done before the last day of the fiscal year. So you have time to start implementing. There are many people who are, particularly the military, who buy these $1 billion of capital goods every year. They can't tell people until the first day of the new year, even if you get it done on time, what the plan is. And now we're 5 months into the new year. We still haven't told these guys what the plan is for this fiscal year.
Back to the appropriators, though, they are the big winners in all of this. Appropriators and leadership. Because in the absence of any process, in the absence of any checks and balances, in the absence of any oversight, in the absence of any transparency, what happens is you come butting up against your next moment when the government runs out of funds and you're going to have a shutdown. And then the folks who have been in the appropriations subcommittees have put together their packages, and if they can make them work, they end up going basically straight through into the not smoke-filled room any longer, the room. And nobody's seen it. It's never been voted on the floor. It just gets jetted straight in. And then 6 people from leadership and the appropriations chairs go in and they hash out the deal amongst themselves. And everybody else in the Senate is left being a supplicant, begging and pleading and hoping that the thing they want gets in there with no chance to have a vote on it, no chance to have a debate on it. And that's not democracy, frankly. It's a mess. But it does confer a very great amount of power. Basically, how we spend all of our money gets decided by 2 hands full of people.
So
in a totally non-transparent environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of us share that frustration completely. And I kind of think about it and I think, gosh, you 2 are U.S. senators. That seems like it should be a pretty cool job. And in the end, it feels like you're not getting to make any decisions. You're not getting to really push this nearly enough. So maybe you don't have to answer that.
We're in a system that is designed to fail.
Well, but that's why we're here, Maya. I mean, that's why we've engaged. I mean, that's why Sheldon and I are trying to do something about this. 44 years. I have to look my children in the eye and my grandchildren and say, you know, I was up here for a period of time. I didn't do anything about that. Are you kidding? $20 trillion of debt with a duration of less than 3 years. I mean, this is serious business we're talking about here. And by the way, you're not going to solve the debt crisis by fixing the budget process alone, but you will not solve it unless and until you do start by fixing the budget process. And let me say one other thing, too. I think that when you look at right now, the other players in this process, there are a number of ways to get at this, but the one thing that I keep coming back to is that you either need to make the budget a law, and therefore it's 60. Yeah. And with real consequences if that budget's not done by April 15th, if you move the fiscal year to the calendar year, if you do that. And the second thing is I really think that you've got to have a longer term plan. We don't have a capital budget in this government. We're buying billions and billions and billions of dollars of long-term capital goods. It takes decades to some of this stuff to actually get built. And yet we don't have a capital budget plan. So there's no long-term plan about how to allocate that. Senator Whitehouse actually came up with an idea, and we have a bill together that actually does that for the debt ceiling. Not the debt ceiling, but the debt as a percentage of GDP. And it's going to take some time to get there. We know that internally. This is not something that's going to be fixed in 10 years or 15 years. This is a long-term proposition. I believe the global bond markets would applaud if we came out with an acknowledgement that we've got a long-term problem and a long-term solution here that put a target out there for debt as a percentage of GDP and brought it back with guardrails. We embraced that. That was something that came out of this work we've been doing very quietly, behind the scenes, no cameras. We've had past chairmen of committees, Democrat, Republican, come in, tell us their views. And you know, these are small steps that I hope the Select Committee will begin to coagulate together here to come up with a meaningful recommendation and hopefully get it to the floor for a real vote this time.
And we both, I think, owe considerable gratitude to Chairman Enzi on the Budget Committee, who has put a lot of hearing time into this. He's put a lot of effort into this. He's been very thoughtful about it. And frankly, it's really hard, even for bipartisan things to happen, if the chairman of a committee isn't giving it license to go. And Chairman Enzi has been, I think, really terrific about this.
Well, and you brought up the debt targets, which is an idea that we have organizationally supported as well for a long time. And I think it is a heavy lift, and I think it would one that would make huge changes and be very impressive if it were able to move forward. Would it change? Would it replace the debt ceiling? What do you think about the debt ceiling? The debt ceiling is something we're going to have to...
That's the only thing that's more dangerous and stupid than Votorama.
But what's so interesting is the debt ceiling is the only sort of fiscal constraint that's out there, and yet it's one that could blow up the entire system. So there has to be something in between.
And achieves nothing when you go through all the agony of the vote. You've achieved nothing except avoiding a self-inflicted catastrophe. So that's not, in my view, productive legislation. When you set a trap for yourself, and then by managing to avoid the trap you set for yourself, you have a victory. No, you haven't. You've completely, that's a time waster. You need to solve this problem. And I think having a long-term glide slope to a sustainable debt to GDP ratio with some guardrails to police for when you're getting out of that range is a much more sensible way to go about doing it. And when you look at the politics up close of these debt ceiling votes, it is a poisonous moment on the Senate and House of Representatives floor.
I'm just practical. It doesn't work. Since 1913, it hasn't worked. We keep bumping it up, so there's always a release valve. The great thing about American politicians is they always leave a back door. And that back door is a release valve, and that release valve is more spending. You have a Democrat and Republican sitting here saying that $21 trillion is not acceptable today. We have to find a way to solve it. Now, we'll differ on how to solve it, but that's what we're arguing for, is to create a politically neutral platform during the budget process that actually is meaningful. We don't have that today. We don't get to sit in a room with the cameras or without the cameras and actually argue tax increase, tax expenditures, spending cuts, military spending. We don't ever get to do that. And that's what's missing in this whole process, I think.
Well, another thing that's missing in this process, which the two of you have overcome, at least with the two of you, is the bipartisan cooperation, the trust that we're going to need. Because the bottom line is, fiscal success is going to require hard choices. There are two political parties that are very at each other right now with very little trust. One of the things that we covered today is a really wonderful effort by Convergence, which came out with these big budget process reforms, which you will both have copies of and be familiar with all their work. But the nice thing about what they did is they brought a bunch of stakeholders who were very different in their perspectives and didn't trust each other at the beginning and worked them through a process till they came to a shared set of recommendations. How do we do that in the Senate? How do we do that on this commission or in the budget committee? The incentives are set up for you not to work together and not to succeed, particularly on these hard choices. And I will add, we've just had two big bills, a tax bill and a spending bill, that have contributed to the fiscal debt that we have, which have added to the mistrust between the parties. So how are we going to pivot from where we have the hole we've dug ourselves into to working together and doing some really hard things?
I go back to process. I think that when you have the process set up so that all of the rewards that are built into the process are rewards of partisanship, then that's what you're going to get. The part of, I think, what brings David and I and other people from we're not the only ones having this conversation on the budget committee together, is that I think we have a shared common interest in either fixing the budget committee so that it actually amounts to something again, or getting off of it, getting rid of it. We got other things to do with our time. There's just no point going through this. To make it useful again, to make it effective again, I think is a very valuable common cause. There's lots of bipartisanship in that. And then once you're over that, now your question is, okay, so we're gonna work together, which we are. What is what we're working on gonna look like? Well, if you haven't set up a process in which there is any reward for bipartisanship, and the only meaningful prize that can be taken from the whole enterprise is a partisan reconciliation bill to jam something through under the 60-vote threshold, it's the only prize in the game. So you're either not going to play the game at all, or that's the prize you're going to go for. You've got to set up another path where the prize can be what David said, a glide slope over a reasonable period of time to a reasonable debt to GDP ratio with reasonable guardrails to police it, and a process that internally has some teeth so the appropriators don't just blow through it, covers tax spending, regular spending, and healthcare cost, and creates that bipartisan path if you're doing that. We don't, in our proposal, you don't even open the gate to that path until you're significantly bipartisan. You want to use it, you got to be bipartisan. So you provide a big reward for going there, which is that you can solve this problem. You can't solve America's budget problem through the budget committee now as its presently, as its process is presently constituted.
Yeah, I think that the reason, the need for the select committee is that the budget committee itself is not, by its structure, not capable of fixing the process, or it would have been fixed. There have been smart people on the budget committee for the last 44 years, but it has never been addressed. The problem here, though, is, in my view, is that you don't just have one budget. We spent about a little over $4 trillion this year, or last year. Only about $1 trillion of that, 1.1, is discretionary, and of that, $600 billion is military, about $200 is VA, and the balance, $350 billion, is all other domestic discretionary spending. So people who say on my side, well, we just need to cut spending. Well, okay, you only have 350 to go. You're going to have a 900 this year, $1 trillion next year, annual deficit shortfall, and so you don't have enough room to just cut there. So then the other $3 trillion is the mandatory side of this thing. That's Social Security, Medicare, pension benefits for federal employees, and the interest on the debt, by the way, is going up like gangbusters. It's already doubled. It's going to double again very shortly. And so this is a very real time. I think the answer to your question, Mike, is that there's a growing realization that this is not acceptable anymore. We are in the crisis phase. We are past the tipping point here. If we don't do something about it, we're going to walk in and it's going to be draconian, the result, if we don't do something about it. There are two issues here. There's the debt that Sheldon and I are working on, but it's also the budget process, which is one of several things that you need to do. We don't just have one budget. You've got a discretionary budget. You also have a Social Security budget that's protected by a trust fund. You have a Medicare budget, which is protected by a trust fund. The problem is those two trust funds go to zero in 14 years. So there's something that's got to be done. If we don't do something now, I promise you, The day that the federal government has to start telling Social Security recipients that we've been irresponsible with this trust and you're not going to get your full benefits, there'll be something done then. And what happens in a lot of countries is they actually dissolve the government and bring in a new government. We don't do that under our Constitution, but there will be dramatic results or ramifications inside an elected body like Congress.
Well, and part of the problem, as you mentioned, is that we don't focus on the long term. So in so many ways, you see the political incentive of just let me put my head down and get through this year or this cycle and not focus on these longer term issues, which are leaving us with resources, right, instead of the next sort of economic issue. And there's so many challenges, things that we're not prepared to deal with as our resources are being deployed in less than perfect ways. One thing I'm curious about, when you go home to your states, what do you hear from voters? I know you don't hear about budget process because it is alienating and boring and nobody is able to engage with the process. But what are you hearing about the debt and the whole overall fiscal situation? Usually I think of this as something that is leadership driven, that voters don't care unless their politicians are telling them to care, and there's been less discussion in the past couple of years than there was before. I think it will come back with trillion-dollar deficits, but what do people in your districts hear?
Here's the problem.
Do they understand what it's going to take?
Here's the problem. We have conditioned the populace of America that the federal government can, number one, solve every problem you have, and we can fund every problem you have. The hurricanes, the fires. We're losing the right to do what we all want to do, and that is to provide a safety net, not only to retirees or to people who need medical care, but for people in emergency. The problem with that is we've been irresponsible in terms of our financial duties, and we're losing the right to do that. And that's why I hear it back home. I ran on debt. I mean, people in the political sphere said, you can't run on that. Well, we did, and they basically convinced people that this was a crisis and we had to do something about it. So in Georgia anyway, I continue to hear that because we started that dialogue 4 years ago. I think, and this is just a personal opinion, I can't prove it with data, but I believe that one of the reasons that Congress's low approval rating is because we don't do the basics. The number one thing the Constitution says our responsibility is to fund the government. And people back home don't really understand what CRs are and omnibus and cromnibus. And by the way, I'm going to create a dictionary one day for all the acronyms and everything else that we use in this budget process that I never heard of before. Reconciliation, I never knew what reconciliation was. Vote-a-rama, these are just silly manifestations of a crowd here in Washington that created this that just doesn't work.
In Rhode Island, if I had to compare the concerns that I hear about Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security against the concerns that I hear about the debt or the deficit, it's probably 90-1. It just is not a big public concern. If you confront people with it, they'll say, oh yeah, that seems like a lot. But part of the problem, I think, is that for a lot of folks, the debt and deficit discussion, particularly since it seems to be turned on and off, depending on whether the Democrats in the White House or not, has an overlay of this isn't for real to it. It has an overlay of, oh, this is just politics. Oh, every time they say deficit, it's because they want to come after my Social Security. Oh, every time they say deficit, it's because they want to come after my Medicare. So there's been a flinch that has been built in recent years that you don't need to take the debt and deficit concerns seriously because they turn on and off depending on the politics of who's in the White House, and they tend to be a vehicle for focusing on a very specific set of outcomes. So if we end up with a circumstance in which the people of America associate doing something about the debt and deficit with taking away their Medicare, we are in a heap of trouble. And that is not a real choice, that is a false choice, but the politics of the way this has morphed itself in the last 10 years that I've been on the budget committee anyway, that is very much coming up. You say debt or deficit to people in Rhode Island, and those who are watching this, they've got to flinch. So wait a minute, I'm putting both hands on my Medicare. Don't you come after that. And so that's a real problem. And that's where the bipartisan process helps, because you can put together the healthcare expense, the appropriated expenditures, the tax spending out the back door, the tax code, revenues where you need them to fill it in, and you can put together a package that people can get behind because it has balance overall And it's not one side taking turns trying to clobber the other side. And it's that back and forth that I think is part of what is disabling in the public discussion about the debt and the deficit. It is not seen as a national goal. It is seen as political leverage to achieve lesser goals.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that when fiscal responsibility is only used as defense, then you lose all your credibility when you're talking about it. And that if it's not done in a bipartisan way, there won't be enough cover, there won't be trust by people from opposite parties. We sort of know that for anything this hard, there's going to have to be more bipartisanship and more consistency. Final question, because our time has run over. But one of the things I was thinking about actually with the Budget Process Commission is we don't know who's going to be running Congress down the road. And this is the rules. This is creating the rules of the game, not the outcomes, not the policies, but just the rules that we'll work within, sort of to the point of the guardrails. So where the decision making gets done. And so it does seem like maybe there's an opportunity to come up with these solutions and say they won't go into effect until after the election. We don't know who will have the majority. Maybe that will somehow make what's going to be reasonably difficult tasks somewhat easier. But my final question for both of you, you gave a lot of kind of buckets of areas of improvement. If you could only make one change to the budget process, what would the change that you think would be most helpful would be?
That's a tough one. I'm torn between...
You can do two.
Kick the penalty for breaking the budget up to 67 votes like it's a treaty. That at least puts the Budget Committee back into the field in some way, but I don't think it gets you very far. So I think that the alternative to that would be to simply just stop the Budget Committees, end the farce, and make people confront this problem head on, realizing that we actually don't have a process for coping with this that is effective. So let's not pretend that we do, let's just knock it out. The best of all would be obviously getting the kind of fix that David and I are talking about done, but that's got about 5 or 6 facets to it, so it's not just one thing.
Well, the challenge is, I think in this order, by December 5th, we are to provide a bill back to the Congress this year. That's light years. I mean, that's moving at a light speed. You know, it seems to me that the first thing you have to do is to realize what a crisis this creates. And again, I will repeat myself. I'm not tied up with any of the minute changes that need to be made to make a budget work. There are a lot of different ways to do that. But if you don't have the consequences, then it doesn't really matter. In the last 9 years, since 2009, we've taken about $400 billion out of discretionary spending in our federal government. The mandatory is where the problem is because of our age and because of the way those are set up. And I agree with Senator Whitehouse that we've got to protect those. But these are just the realities. And so this is why now is the time. You know, I got to meet Chairman Greenspan a couple of times over the last couple of years, and he reminds me every time about a meeting just like this in 1983, when they started talking about the budget process and the mandatory expenses, and they did the math out when the baby boomers all get into retirement age and so forth, and says this is not sustainable. They knew it in '83. Here we are, you know, 30 years later, and we're still talking about this. The number one thing I would do, you can't do just one thing because the structure itself is so bad. The committee structure is so bad. The appropriating and authorization tie-in does not work, will never work. But I go back to, and I'll be redundant in this, doesn't matter what you do to change it, you have to have consequences that are real to the member, not just to the staff and not just to expenditures. Sequestration was the stupidest thing that I've ever seen come out of Washington. I'll tell anybody that. They thought it was so draconian that it would never happen. Well, guess what? It did happen. It was a release valve, and then to go, well, I voted against it, but you know what? That day is over, that I can go home and tell people, yeah, it didn't pass, but I voted for it, all right? It passed, but I voted against it. That's no longer good enough back home. They're holding us accountable, and should, for the number one responsibility we have in Congress, and that is to fund the federal government.
Okay, well, Senators, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.